The palace was already awake when the footage surfaced, lights humming low, corridors breathing with routine, everything appearing exactly as it always had. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside a secured room, behind a door that required 3 clearances and a code that rotated every 12 hours, time seemed to hesitate. The screen glowed in the dark like a held breath. It was not the length of the clip that made it dangerous. It was not even what could be seen at first glance. It was the context, the setting, the proximity, the unmistakable presence of a child framed by stone walls older than most nations. A moment captured without intent, without performance. Raw, unrehearsed, unprotected. By the time Prince William was informed, the machinery of containment had already begun to turn. Protocols whispered into motion. Advisors spoke in fragments. Language softened what it could not erase. This was how the institution survived, by moving faster than conscience, quieter than truth. But as William stood alone with the footage, watching it once, then again, something fractured, not loudly, not publicly, but irreversibly. The crown had always promised protection. The question now was simple and unbearable. Protection of whom? And at what cost? The courtyard was silent now, but the echo of that command still hung in the air. Hours before, it seemed like any other morning at the palace. Doors opening on precise hinges, guards standing in disciplined alignment, the soft hiss of heated marble beneath polished boots. Yet, in a windowless room at the heart of the household, a screen glowed with a truth no protocol had anticipated. A child, small and unguarded, caught in the lens of something that should never have existed, and a senior royal nearby, poised in a moment that would ripple across blood and duty alike. Prince William, called quietly to the room by an aide who did not meet his eyes, watched the footage with restraint born of years and shadow of tradition. The room smelled of polished wood and old paper, the faint trace of wax floors amplifying the gravity of what was before him. The hum of monitors and the faint click of a security system became the only soundtrack to a scene that demanded silence, observation, and an impossible choice. The clip played again, each frame revealing subtle, devastating nuance. Hands hovering, expressions caught mid-thought, the faint echo of laughter, an ordinary sound transformed into a weapon of moral consequence. Every second challenged the monarchy's delicate balance between public perception and private truth. William's jaw tightened. He understood, in that suspended moment, the fragility of the institution he had inherited. Centuries of order, of ritual, of unspoken loyalty, now teetering on a single frame of light and shadow. Behind the palace gates, life carried on as if nothing had happened. The gardens were immaculate, fountains spilling into stone basins with the rhythmic perfection of clockwork, and the public would soon see smiling faces, curated appearances, rehearsed gestures of unity. Yet inside, the machinery of discretion had already begun to churn. Advisors whispered in cautious tones. Legal minds parsed every possible scenario. Security officers double-checked access logs, tracing the footage to its origin, ensuring no one had yet breached the invisible barrier separating information from revelation. Every movement was methodical, deliberate, designed to contain a truth that demanded exposure yet could not be allowed to breathe. William rose from his chair, the weight of the crown pressing invisibly upon his shoulders. There were decisions to be made that had no precedent, no guiding manual. One wrong move, and centuries of reputation could crumble like dust. He thought of the child, not as a symbol, but as a life intersecting with the machinery of legacy and protocol. He thought of the family, of the crown, of the silent obligation to protect what could never be undone. And he knew this was a moment where blood, duty, and conscience collided. Hours passed in near silence, punctuated only by the occasional hum of equipment. William replayed the footage, not to relive it, but to measure the dimensions of responsibility. The room itself seemed to constrict, as if the walls understood the gravity of observation. Even the smallest gestures, the tilt of the head, the shift of a foot, the subtle glance of concern, carry weight far beyond their apparent insignificance. Protocols existed to define order, but this moment existed to test them, to expose the limits of what rules and hierarchy could contain. Outside, the palace moved in choreographed grace. Couriers delivered messages. Carriages rolled along cobblestones, and staff continued duties, unaware that the institution they serve had been breached not by outsiders, but by the unfiltered truth itself. William walked slowly, deliberately, between the screens and the windowed corridor. Each footstep was measured, each breath steady, masking the turmoil that threatened to surface. He understood the paradox. He must act, but to act recklessly would betray both duty and family. The first decision was made quietly, almost imperceptibly. A protocol invoked that would restrict access, limit exposure, and impose layers of confidentiality designed to shield the household from the ripple of consequence. Yet even as the containment procedures activated, William could feel the fissure forming. The palace had always survived through silence, through control, through the careful orchestration of perception. But this, the raw, unedited truth, was immune to choreography. He paused by the window overlooking the eastern courtyard. Light spilled onto the marble, glinting off fountains, reflecting the world outside, serene and unaware. In that reflection, William saw both the crown and its cost. Every generation had faced moments of exposure. Some had survived, others had faltered. Yet never before had the stakes felt so immediate, so intimate, so inseparable from the very life he was sworn to protect. Advisors approached with caution, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward the screen that still held evidence. Every word they spoke was measured, coded, designed to navigate around acknowledgement while still conveying urgency. William absorbed each statement, each clarification, each layer of procedural logic, aware that even the most minor misstep could cascade into scandal. Trust, loyalty, and discretion, all the pillars of the institution, were now tested by a single frame, by a single moment of exposure that no protocol could erase. He thought again of the child. The image burned not just for its visual clarity, but for its moral resonance. Here was a life intersecting with authority, legacy, and expectation, and in that intersection, the potential for harm was immense. Protecting the child meant navigating a labyrinth of hierarchy, legal oversight, and emotional weight. Protecting the crown meant something different, something broader, but not necessarily safer. And William realized with a clarity both chilling and immediate that these duties could not exist in parallel without conflict. Minutes became hours. Every consultation, every decision, every calculation added to the gravity pressing upon him. The palace, in all its historical grandeur, felt suddenly smaller, its walls closer, as if even stone and marble could sense the impossibility of erasure. And yet, within the tension, there was resolve. Protocol would be observed, carefully, meticulously, but it would not blind him to the humanity at stake. There was a balance to strike, a line to walk between the machinery of tradition and the imperatives of conscience. By nightfall, the first formal actions were taken. Access logs revised, footage cataloged in classified systems, communications restricted. Each act was deliberate, silent, almost invisible, yet weighted with consequence. The palace machinery moved to protect itself, as it always had. But this time, William understood, it could not fully contain the truth. There was a fracture now, subtle but undeniable, in the seamless image presented to the world. The illusion of unity and control had been challenged, and no amount of procedure could fully restore it. In the quiet aftermath, William returned to the monitor one last time. The child's presence, the nuances of gesture and expression, the unspoken context, all lingered in memory. This was no longer just a moment recorded. It was a moral imperative, and in that imperative lay the first real weight of action. The understanding that protection was not a matter of secrecy alone, but of conscience, of choice, and of courage when no one else could bear it. The palace slept, the world outside oblivious, and yet inside, a single decision had been made, a decision that would set the tone for every move to follow. Blood and duty, legacy and conscience, authority and innocence. All were entwined in that choice, and all would be tested in the days to come. One thing was certain. The palace had never faced a moment like this, and the machinery of survival could only stretch so far before it strained against the weight of truth. And as William stepped away from the monitor, the thought remained, unspoken but undeniable. Some moments are captured not for posterity, but to demand reckoning, and this was one of them. The echo of the morning's revelation still lingered in William's mind, though the palace itself had resumed its usual rhythm. Marble floors reflected the muted glow of chandeliers, the faint scent of polished wood, and wax stone lingering in corridors long accustomed to order. But the order was deceptive. Behind velvet ropes, behind classified doors, behind the careful choreography of staff and household officers, the machinery of protocol had shifted imperceptibly but irreversibly. William moved deliberately through corridors, past guards whose eyes were trained to detect threat, yet could not register moral uncertainty. He understood the palace as it had been designed, a living organism, each department a vein, each officer a pulse in a system engineered to neutralize disruption. He paused outside the security control room, listening to the faint hum of servers and monitors. Each blip, each digital flicker, represented surveillance, oversight, containment, a lattice of information designed to preserve continuity. And yet, the lattice had been pierced. Inside, senior aides whispered in the clipped cadence of professional caution. Words were chosen for precision, sentences for deniability. Footage has been secured. One began, voice low, controlled, but betraying tension in the subtle rise at the end. Access restricted. Only necessary personnel. William nodded, acknowledging both the report and the subtext. Someone, somewhere, had deviated. He pressed further, quietly reconstructing the chain of custody. Every approval, every signature, every swipe of a key card was examined. Discrepancies emerged, not dramatic, not immediately alarming, but deliberate in their subtle irregularity. A junior archivist shuffled nervously, offering fragmentary records, eyes downcast. William noted the hesitation, the careful avoidance of gaze, the unspoken fear of consequence rather than scandal. This was a palace conditioned to obedience. Yet obedience had its limits. Behind the velvet ropes, hierarchy dictated not just behavior but thought. What could be questioned, what must be assumed, and what was simply unmentionable? The archivist's unease was a signal. The moment was moving beyond procedural containment and into moral reckoning. Every detail mattered. The time stamps on the footage, the sequence of logins, the chain of viewing. William absorbed each with clarity that made the room seem smaller, the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. Each anomaly, no matter how minor, became a lens through which the palace's vulnerabilities were visible. In these details, he discerned the subtle patterns of deviation. A guard whose authorization code had been entered twice by accident, a system access flagged for review but quietly overlooked, a set of archival permissions that bore signatures unrecognized by protocol. These are the cracks that could widen into fracture. Conversations with protection officers revealed further tension. Language was precise, measured, coded. No breach occurred. No unauthorized viewings confirmed. Yet their hands betrayed anxiety. Fingers tapping lightly against clipboards, the faint thrum of a pulse just beneath the surface. William listened, piecing together not just what happened, but why. He understood that the palace had survived for centuries not because it was infallible, but because it contained a willingness to enforce obedience, even at the expense of truth. The new threat was not external. It was moral. It was internal. Meanwhile, the household staff moved with their usual seamless efficiency. Polished silverware, freshly pressed linens, precise arrangements of flowers in ceremonial vases. The surface image of perfection persisted, deliberately, insistently. But William's attention was on what was unseen. The closed office doors, the folders marked confidential, the small exchange of glances between aides that betrayed understanding without words. Every layer of protocol was designed to insulate, to slow perception, to neutralize awareness. And yet, the anomaly had occurred. The machinery could not reverse what had already been observed. He summoned the senior protection officer to the control room, a man who had served 3 generations of the household. Their conversation was precise, but the tension between lines was palpable. "We followed procedure," the officer said, but the sequence was unusual. There was no prior authorization for a secondary review, yet the footage was accessed twice outside the usual chain. William nodded, acknowledging mechanics, yet the moral weight pressed heavier than any procedural irregularity. The palace had methods, codes, and hierarchies to handle breaches. But this moment, This exposure tested the boundaries between procedure and conscience. William's investigation continued through layers of classified documentation, internal memos, security logs, digital timestamps, archival restrictions. All were meticulously reviewed. Patterns of compliance and deviation emerged like the slow revelation of a map hidden beneath centuries of dust. He traced each decision, each approval, each hesitation. The inconsistencies were deliberate yet subtle, calculated to evade detection, but impossible to ignore once seen through the lens of consequence. There was a method here, a strategy designed not to cause harm, but to preserve the image of order, even at the cost of truth. By mid-afternoon, the palace had assumed its external appearance of calm. Visitors passed through gardens. The press saw smiling faces, and public routines continued untouched. But inside, tension simmered. William met with the senior household manager, whose hands betrayed a nervous habit of smoothing papers in a gesture meant to convey control. "Every precaution has been taken," she said softly. "Yet there are anomalies." William's eyes narrowed, the gravity of understatement clear. Anomalies were not mere mistakes. They were signals, the first indicators that the moment was escaping containment. Throughout the day, William reconstructed the network of custody with meticulous care. Each digital footprint, each archival log, each personnel record was cross-checked. The pattern became undeniable. Someone had allowed a deliberate, deniable breach, small enough to evade immediate detection, significant enough to challenge the palace's illusion of unbroken control. The quiet fear that rippled through staff was not for reputation, but for consequence, disciplinary, legal, moral. In these silent currents, William discerned the stakes. The palace would act to protect itself, but the question of conscience was alone. Later, in the security room, he reviewed the footage again. Subtle details previously unnoticed now carried weight. The alignment of shadows, the faint expression of awareness on a guard's face, the hesitant movement of aides responding to an unspoken cue. Each frame told a story beyond its visual content. It revealed intent, hesitation, calculation. The palace, he realized, functioned like a clockwork organism. Each component calibrated to maintain order, but even the most precise mechanisms were vulnerable to human choice. And here, human choice had intersected with legacy, authority, and responsibility in a way that demanded reckoning. By evening, William had convened a quiet assembly of key personnel. Senior aides, household managers, security officers. Words were careful, legalistic, and coded, designed to convey authority without alarm. Yet beneath the surface, every gesture, every pause, every glance communicated awareness of the stakes. Loyalty, duty, and preservation of the institution were being weighed against transparency, morality, and the protection of the vulnerable. The conflict was silent but profound. Decisions would be made in these shadows, unseen by the public, yet shaping the future of both family and crown. The day ended with subtle but decisive breach of protocol, a small, deliberate action. Access granted to one trusted aide outside normal procedure. A folder moved to a secure but unconventional location. It was deniable, imperceptible to all but the most careful observer, yet significant. William understood immediately. This was no longer routine oversight. It was the first tangible step toward confrontation. The palace's apparatus of containment was responding, but it was being tested. And as he left the room, walking past the flickering monitors and hum of servers, he knew that the breach signaled the beginning of a reckoning that could not be contained by rules alone. In the quiet corridors, life appeared unchanged. Candles flickered in ornate sconces, polished floors reflected chandeliers, and staff moved with practiced precision. Yet beneath the velvet ropes, behind the doors marked confidential, the pulse of tension was undeniable. A moral fracture had emerged, subtle yet permanent, and William understood. The palace was no longer just a guardian of legacy. It had become a crucible where duty, conscience, and authority collided. As night settled, he stood by the window overlooking the gardens, the faint illumination of fountains reflecting in the pools below. The machinery of protocol would continue to move, deliberate, silent, and precise. But the truth had found its mark. And in its presence, every choice, every hesitation, every action would carry weight beyond procedure, beyond hierarchy, beyond the palace walls themselves. The palace had changed by dawn, though nothing outside its gates had shifted. Marble floors reflected the pale winter light. The corridors stretched in familiar precision. Yet inside, a different rhythm pulsed. One dictated not by protocol, but by doubt. William moved through the household with the weight of observation pressing upon him. Each footstep, each glance, each careful nod carried consequence. The footage had become more than an image. It was now a moral fulcrum, and every interaction within these walls pivoted around it. He convened his first private meeting of senior aides and household managers. The room smelled of polished wood and old ink, the faint echo of boots on marble filling the spaces between words. "We have inconsistencies," he began, voice calm, formal, but edged with tension. "And they must be accounted for." The aides responded in practiced tones, carefully selected phrases designed to assure and placate. Yet beneath the polished veneer, William perceived hesitation, subtle resistance, the quiet tremor of loyalty challenged by conscience. The dialogue that followed was taught. Protocols were followed. One senior aide said, each syllable precise, almost rehearsed. William's eyes did not leave her face. Procedures were observed. Another added, softer, as if saying aloud might make it true. Yet the cracks were evident. Logs contradicted statements. Authorizations bore anomalies. Each explanation, rooted in tradition, carried weight in hierarchy but none in accountability. William pressed, patiently, deliberately, revealing the inconsistencies one by one. In the hush of the room, the unspoken tension thickened. The aides were not afraid of the footage itself. They feared the consequences of acknowledgement, the repercussions of admitting that within these walls, mistakes had been made, that human choice had overridden centuries of procedure. William leaned forward, voice low but firm. "We are not here to preserve comfort. We are here to understand responsibility. And responsibility does not reside in the absence of fault." As the discussion unfolded, William traced a chain of decisions surrounding the footage, following each approval, each hesitation, each deviation. Motives emerged: fear of scandal, desire to protect legacy, instinct to preserve hierarchy, but each was now measured against the weight of conscience. He realized, with growing clarity, that the issue was no longer procedural. It was personal. Tradition and authority could no longer shield the household from scrutiny when the truth demanded accountability. The first confrontation was quiet, yet electric. A senior protection officer, veteran of decades, finally voiced the unspoken tension. The chain was compromised, he admitted, eyes steady but voice tight. By design, perhaps. We acted contained, but he did not finish the sentence. Yet the implication was clear. The palace had mechanisms, but these mechanisms had been deliberately bent. William absorbed the gravity. Loyalty had been weaponized, hierarchy exploited, and the child's well-being placed at the intersection of moral and institutional compromise. Hours passed in methodical review. Each member of the household, from aides to managers to archivists, became a node in a network of authority under examination. Every decision, every action, every gesture now carried amplified significance. William traced anomalies back through days, weeks, months of routine operations, uncovering patterns that had been invisible in isolation, but now formed a clear narrative. The palace, in its perfection of protocol, had also perfected discretion at the cost of accountability. The tension reached its emotional midpoint when William addressed the senior staff directly. "We speak of preservation, of tradition, of loyalty," he said. "But what of protection? Of responsibility? The footage is not isolated. It is a symptom of a system that allows immunity where oversight should prevail. And we, this household, this institution, must answer for it." Silence followed, long and suffocating, the kind of silence that presses against the air like weight. The moral question was no longer hypothetical. Who had the right to decide what survives, and at what cost? Private conversations, previously harmless, now carried profound implications. Officers spoke in code. Aides exchanged fleeting glances, the subtle tension of loyalty clashing with conscience palpable in every gesture. William observed, absorbed, calculated. The palace, for all its centuries of order, revealed itself as a structure not merely of stone and ceremony, but of choice. Every action taken to protect the institution was also an action that shaped morality. And in that shaping, he realized the stakes were immense. The future of the legacy, the safety of the child, and the integrity of the household itself were intertwined in a delicate, precarious equilibrium. Confrontations escalated as the day wore on. A mid-ranking officer, tasked with safeguarding sensitive records, admitted to deviations, small, deniable, but deliberate. William's response was measured, controlled, yet edged with the weight of authority. Denial is insufficient, he said. Responsibility is not erased by intention alone. Each acknowledgement of deviation became a fulcrum, shifting loyalty from blind adherence to reflection, from protection of tradition to consideration of consequence. The palace was learning, slowly, painfully, that authority without accountability was vulnerable even in its most disciplined corridors. The turning point came with a revelation of precedent. Historical files, previously sealed and unexamined, disclosed similar moments. Incidents erased quietly, decisions executed in shadows, and consequences deferred indefinitely. William read each case with precision, connecting dots across generations. The footage in question was no anomaly. It was part of a broader culture-controlled immunity, a silent agreement that some actions, no matter how ethically fraught, would remain unseen. The weight of history, once abstract, now pressed tangibly on every participant in the household. Loyalties began to fracture visibly. Allies of the past, committed to hierarchy above all, resisted scrutiny. Younger staff, guided by conscience rather than tradition, questioned deviation, risked moral exposure. Conversations that had been polite, controlled, procedural now carried an electric tension. The palace, in its centuries of self-preservation, was confronting a fissure between protecting legacy and safeguarding morality, a fissure that William navigated with both firmness and foresight. As night fell, William convened a smaller, decisive council. Only the most trusted aides remained. The footage was reviewed once more, but now under the lens of consequence rather than observation. Decisions were made, irreversible, unseen by the public, morally weighty. Protocols were bent where necessary, hierarchy respected yet questioned, and the first steps toward internal reckoning were taken. What had been a procedural breach was now a catalyst, forcing every participant to confront the limits of loyalty, the boundaries of authority, and the moral imperative of conscience. By midnight, the palace seemed outwardly unchanged. Candles flickered in sconces, polished floors reflected chandeliers, and staff moved with the quiet efficiency of long practice. Yet beneath the surface, the household had divided. Those who would protect the past, preserving hierarchy and tradition above all, and those who would guard the future, prioritizing conscience, morality, and the well-being of the vulnerable. William understood the landscape. Authority and bloodline were no longer sufficient to maintain order. Moral courage, deliberate choice, and accountability would define the course of the institution from this moment forward. And in the quiet aftermath, as he returned alone to the room where the footage had first appeared, William reflected on the collision he had witnessed. Tradition demanded obedience. Hierarchy demanded loyalty. But conscience demanded action. The footage had revealed more than a single indiscretion. It had exposed the tension at the heart of power itself, the delicate balance between authority and morality, and the choice every generation must make when the two come into conflict. The palace corridors were quiet, but the weight of silence pressed heavy on every polished surface. Doors closed with precision, footsteps fell in measured rhythm, and the world outside remained blissfully unaware. Yet within these walls, the aftermath of yesterday's revelations had begun to unfold, a subtle, almost imperceptible ripple moving to the household, touching aides, protection officers, and senior staff alike. Every gesture, every glance carried the tension of unspoken truth. The cost of silence was now tangible. William moved through the corridors, absorbing the signs. Conversations ending abruptly when he entered, hands lingering over folders before lowering carefully, eyes flicking toward him with hesitation, then away. The palace had always relied on discretion, but now discretion had become a test of conscience. Hidden in the quiet gestures were moral choices, weighed and measured, as each member of the household decided what they would acknowledge and what they would suppress. The machinery of silence was a living entity, efficient, disciplined, but morally conflicted. He convened a series of private meetings, speaking with those whose roles had previously been unquestioned. Archivists, protection officers, aides, they presented facts, procedure reports, logs, and authorizations. But beneath the facts, William discerned unease, uncertainty about what could be revealed, anxiety about consequence, and most importantly, a deep awareness that the rules of protocol were no longer sufficient to contain the moral weight of the footage. Every document, every signed note, every carefully worded memo became both a shield and a trap. The first confrontation came with a senior aide who had previously appeared unflappable. William's voice was quiet but deliberate. "There are omissions in your reports," he said. "Intentional or not, these omissions have consequences." The aide's hands trembled slightly, a subtle confession of fear rather than guilt. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating, as the full weight of accountability pressed on both men. The palace, so long a place where procedure shielded reality, now required courage to speak, to act, and to acknowledge failure. William reviewed historical precedents, searching for guidance. Archives revealed similar moments, incidents once quietly resolved, evidence erased, consequences deferred. Each file was meticulously cataloged, yet each told the same story. When faced with exposure, the palace had chosen containment over transparency, hierarchy over morality. The realization was chilling. The present crisis was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern, a long-standing system where silence had been the primary tool of governance. Throughout the day, William moved between meetings, reviews, and silent reflection. The palace operated with mechanical precision, yet underneath, human emotion strained against the constraints of duty. Staff whispered in coded language, each word chosen to communicate allegiance without revealing vulnerability. Loyalties fractured subtly. Some defended procedure as sacred, some defended conscience as paramount. The collision of these forces created tension palpable in the air, almost audible in the quiet hum of servers and the faint creak of polished floors. A breakthrough came when a junior officer confessed to actions previously concealed, deliberate deviations from protocol intended to protect, but done without authorization. William listened, absorbing not only the facts, but the reasoning, the moral calculus. Here was a life weighed against tradition, conscience against hierarchy. The admission shifted the landscape. The palace, in its centuries of controlled order, had now been forced to reckon with human agency, with the fact that even the most disciplined systems cannot fully contain moral choice. Late afternoon brought another revelation. A set of sealed files, long considered historical precedent, revealed actions taken to conceal incidents of equal gravity in the past. William read each carefully, connecting dots across generations. The same patterns appeared: containment prioritized, reputation preserved, accountability deferred. The weight of history pressed upon him, and he understood that the decisions he faced were not just isolated. They were part of a continuum, a moral inheritance that he now bore. As evening approached, tension within the household became tangible. Staff moved deliberately, but conversations were clipped, glances fleeting, eyes avoiding acknowledgement. The palace, once a sanctuary of seamless order, now resembled a network of fragile alliances, each participant calculating the balance between self-preservation and duty. William's presence magnified the stakes. Every decision, every gesture, every word was measured against his judgment. Silence was no longer neutral. It was consequential. In the quiet of the control room, William reviewed the footage again. The images had not changed, but his understanding had deepened. Each expression, each gesture, each small movement spoke not only to the events themselves, but to the moral architecture surrounding them. The palace had failed to protect truth in the past. Now, it was his responsibility to navigate the consequences. And the cost of silence, long deferred, previously invisible, was revealed in full, in real time, in every subtle reaction of those around him. The moral tension escalated as William confronted the senior protection officer. "We have operated for generations under the assumption that protocol is sufficient," he said. "But it is not. Not when lives intersect with authority. Not when conscience is at stake." The officer nodded, understanding the weight of the statement. The machinery of discipline, long relied upon to enforce obedience, was inadequate in the face of moral exposure. Choices had to be made, consequences anticipated, and actions executed, all within invisible bounds of propriety and secrecy. Late into the night, William cataloged the anomalies, reconciled the historical precedents, and made deliberate, calculated decisions to contain what could not be disclosed publicly. Files were secured, communications restricted, and subtle procedural adjustments enacted to minimize further exposure. Each action was deliberate, morally weighted, and designed to balance authority with conscience. The palace had been forced to operate in a new paradigm, not only preserving legacy, but accounting for moral consequence in real time. As midnight approached, the corridors were silent, the staff withdrawn into their chambers, and the world outside remained unaware of the subtle fracture within these walls. Yet William understood the cost of silence was never neutral. Each unspoken word, each deferred action, each carefully concealed truth carried weight. The palace, in its centuries of grandeur, had relied on discretion, but now discretion demanded judgment, courage, and the willingness to confront moral responsibility in isolation. Standing alone in the monitoring room, William reflected on the day's revelations. History had not been kind to those who acted without counsel, but neither had it preserved those who acted without conscience. The palace, for all its authority, all its hierarchy, all its precision, could not erase what had been observed, could not contain what had been acknowledged, and could not fully protect the vulnerable. The cost of silence had been made real, tangible, and unavoidable. And as he left the room, the thought lingered, unspoken but undeniable. Every choice now carried the weight of generations. Every decision would define not just the household, but the future of those it was sworn to protect. And some truths, once recognized, cannot be ignored. The palace had settled into its evening rhythm. The corridors bathed in a soft, amber glow, the shadows of chandeliers stretching across polished marble floors. Outside, the world remained unaware of the fractures within, moving to its own rhythms of news, appointments, and appearances. Inside, however, the quiet tension had transformed. What had begun as procedural anomalies and subtle breaches of protocol had evolved into a deliberate moral reckoning, one that demanded courage where comfort had always prevailed. William moved through the household with measured precision, aware of the gaze of every aide, every officer, every archivist who had borne witness to the day's revelations. Each step carried weight, each pause communicated authority, and each word, though carefully chosen, carried moral consequence. The palace's machinery of preservation had responded, but the machinery alone could not resolve the question that now dominated every corridor. Who would protect the child, and who would preserve the institution at the expense of innocence? The first deliberate acts were taken quietly. Access to sensitive areas was restricted, permissions redefined, and custodianship of archival materials reassigned. These measures were not punitive. They were preventative, ensuring that no further deviations could occur while the household recalibrated its internal priorities. Staff were instructed subtly, formally, without alarm, that responsibility had shifted. The emphasis was now protection, moral, procedural, and personal, rather than mere compliance with tradition. William convened a meeting with senior aides and protection officers. The tone was controlled, formal, yet unmistakably weighted with consequence. "We have long relied on discretion to maintain continuity," he began. "But discretion without conscience has placed those we are sworn to protect at risk. That ends today." Every word landed deliberately. The aides understood that the palace had crossed an invisible threshold, from procedure to moral duty, from containment to action. There was no room for hesitation, no allowance for deflection. Throughout the day, William oversaw the reorganization of oversight protocols. Staff roles were clarified, permissions redefined, and access carefully segmented. Every adjustment served a single purpose: to place the child's safety above hierarchy, tradition, and reputation. The palace's mechanisms of power, long oriented toward preserving image, were now redirected towards safeguarding the vulnerable. For the first time in memory, the moral imperative outweighed the ceremonial, the human outweighed the institutional. In private consultations, William addressed aides and officers individually. Each conversation was deliberate, carefully measured, but emotionally charged. "You are entrusted not with preserving appearances," he explained, "but with ensuring that truth and protection are inseparable. That is the responsibility you bear." The weight of the statement was unmistakable. Even those most committed to hierarchy felt the shift. Obedience alone was no longer sufficient. Conscience now defined authority. The day progressed with deliberate, methodical action. Files were secured, access logs revised, and oversight reinforced. Staff who had previously operated under routine hierarchy now understood the significance of their choices. Every decision, however small, carried moral weight. Protocol no longer dictated action. Conscience did. The palace's machinery of control was still active, precise, and disciplined, but it now functioned in service protection, not image. A pivotal moment occurred when William met privately with the senior protection officer. The conversation was quiet, almost intimate, yet carried the weight of moral judgment. "We cannot allow past patterns to dictate present action," William said. "The crown protects life first, the institution second." The officer, veteran of decades, nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the paradigm shift. Authority, once absolute, had been tempered by conscience. Loyalty, once procedural, had become moral. Throughout the evening, small, deliberate acts reinforced the shift. Certain areas were closed to all but essential personnel. Communication lines were restructured to ensure accountability, and surveillance protocols were revised to prioritize safety over secrecy. These measures, though subtle, carried profound significance. The palace, long a symbol of continuity and order, was now functioning as a protector not of appearance, but of life and moral responsibility. As night deepened, William reflected on the implications of these decisions. For centuries, the crown had relied on discretion to maintain authority, on silence to preserve image. Now, discretion was guided by conscience, and silence was replaced by vigilant protection. The palace's longevity had depended on maintaining the illusion of perfection. Its future now depended on the courage to act when silence was no longer sufficient. The household, having absorbed these changes, began to operate with a new clarity. Staff moved with purpose. Officers observed protocol infused with moral oversight, and aides understood that their role was now defined not only by loyalty, but by ethical responsibility. Every action, every decision, every gesture was now aligned with a single objective: safeguarding the child, protecting innocence, and preventing history from repeating itself in quiet concealment. By the early hours of the morning, William stood once more overlooking the palace grounds. Fountains glimmered in the moonlight, corridors stretched in shadowed order, and the world outside remained unaware of the profound shift that had occurred. The machinery of the palace was intact, its protocols precise, yet its moral compass had been recalibrated. Protection was no longer about hierarchy or tradition alone. It was about courage, conscience, and a deliberate choice to act before silence became complicity. In the quiet reflection of that night, William understood the burden he had assumed. History would not record these actions. The public would remain unaware, yet the weight of responsibility rested entirely upon him. To protect the child, to safeguard the future, he had acted decisively, privately, morally. The palace had survived not by hiding truth, but by confronting it. Silently, deliberately, without spectacle. The crown, he realized, had always been a symbol of authority. But in that moment, it became a symbol of responsibility, of moral courage, of protection beyond protocol. And in that transformation lay both the dignity and the weight of true leadership. The palace, from the outside, remained unchanged. Its stone walls caught the morning sun with the same luminous dignity. Its fountains spilled water in precise arcs, and the gates opened and closed with the calm rhythm of centuries. Yet within those walls, the machinery had been irrevocably altered. Decisions had been made, actions taken, and moral reckonings confronted quietly, deliberately, unseen by the public. The palace had always communicated through protocol, procedure, and appearance, but now its language had shifted. The silence itself was meaningful. William moved slowly through corridors, the echo of his footsteps measured, almost meditative. Every detail, the faint scent of waxed floors, the subdued gleam of polished wood, the soft hum of electrical systems, was amplified by reflection. The events of the past days had taught him that authority alone cannot define morality. Hierarchy alone cannot protect innocence. Leadership, he understood, is a crucible of unseen choices, and the weight of those choices is felt most acutely in the absence of acknowledgement. He paused in the private study, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. Historical texts lined the shelves, artifacts of tradition and continuity, reminders of the weight of legacy. Yet the true measure of the palace was not in its relics or archives, but in the quiet, deliberate acts that safeguarded life and conscience against the inertia of protocol. William reflected on the choices he had made, the reorganization of oversight, the recalibration of responsibility, the moral prioritization of protection over image. These acts, unrecorded and unseen, defined the present more than any public ceremony ever could. The child's well-being, previously a peripheral concern in the machinery of hierarchy, had become the axis around which the palace now turned. Actions were recalibrated to anticipate, to prevent, and to protect. Staff had absorbed a lesson. Authority without conscience is hollow, and obedience without reflection is dangerous. The lessons of silence had been internalized. No longer would expedience or tradition alone dictate responses. Conscience now guided procedure, and moral responsibility was integrated into every layer of operation. In quiet moments, William considered the broader implications. The palace, like any institution, thrives on continuity, on stability, on the seamless orchestration of perception. But continuity cannot exist without moral anchoring. Stability cannot be sustained in protection, is deferred to reputation alone. And perception, though carefully managed, cannot shield the innocent from harm when those entrusted with oversight remain silent. The events that had unfolded, while contained, had exposed a tension between authority and conscience. A tension the palace must now navigate consciously. Late afternoon brought a solitary walk through the gardens. Fountains glimmered in the soft light, the hedges meticulously trimmed, the paths swept and orderly. The world outside remained unaware, moving through its routines of observation, commentary, and expectation. Yet within the palace, choices had been made that could never be undone, and their consequences would ripple forward quietly, subtly, through the generations. Leadership, William understood, is often defined by the unseen. The decisions taken in solitude, the judgments rendered without applause, the moral courage exercised when no witness is present. He reflected on the nature of duty itself. Power tests morality not in moments of ceremony or public scrutiny, but in the quiet, unobserved intersections where choice and consequence collide. The crown, the institution, the legacy, all are vessels shaped not only by visible acts but by the accumulation of unseen decisions. Each day, each deliberate action, contributes to an inheritance that is both moral and structural, an inheritance that demands courage when silence is easiest and conscience when obedience is simplest. William returned to the monitoring room one final time. Screens flicker with the mundane, the cataloging of documents, the archival processes, the routine surveillance that had long defined oversight. Yet the significance of these systems had shifted. Each log, each digital footprint, each layer of supervision now carried moral dimension. The palace had been transformed quietly, decisively, and without spectacle. A living institution recalibrated to protect what mattered most, even when the world would never know. As evening descended, he considered the paradox of leadership, that the crown could remain unbroken while its moral core had been tested, reshaped, and strengthened. Protection of life, protection of conscience, protection of the vulnerable. These were not acts performed for recognition, nor even for preservation of legacy alone. They were the essence of responsibility, exercised in silence, measured in choices rather than declarations, and remembered only by those present to act. The corridors, now empty, reflected faintly in polished floors. Candles flickered in sconces, their light dancing across the walls in quiet rhythm. The palace's grandeur remained intact, unchanged in appearance, yet fundamentally altered in operation. Authority now bore conscience, obedience now carried responsibility, and silence now held meaning. The lessons of exposure, of moral reckoning, of deliberate protection, had been embedded permanently. In the solitude of reflection, William understood the final truth. Power, inherited or commanded, is defined not by spectacle, ceremony, or tradition, but by the choices taken when no one watches. The palace had endured because it had learned, finally, that preservation of the institution is inseparable from protection of those it serves. And in that quiet lesson lay the essence of leadership, moral courage, and the inheritance of conscience. The palace stands as it always has, outwardly unchanged, yet within irrevocably transformed. And somewhere in its corridors, decisions unspoken, truths unrecorded, and courage unseen will continue to shape its legacy, waiting for the next moment when conscience must rise above comfort.